Cool. Well, first of all, thanks everybody for joining. I know it's super nice weather outside, so I appreciate everybody is actually here watching this webinar. So before we jump into the webinar where we have Robert and Jonathan, I wanted to do a bit of promotion about our new product we're rolling out, which is very relevant for the whole novel foods piece, which is our data product. So as you know, we are the largest marketplace in Europe. We have more than 2,500 products live. We have more than 150 brands live, and that allows us to collect a lot of data on Alphagreen.io and then put it into visualized dashboards and then analyze. One of the conclusions, for example, if you look at all the CBD oils which have more than 20 orders on Alphagreen, and if you split it by type, you can actually see that broad spectrum and full spectrum are the dominant products which are being sold actually much better than isolate. At the same time, we do know that given that there was a lot of noise from the FSA and from various kind of consultancies, that actually a lot of brands started to launch isolate products. And what's interesting is that you can clearly see full spectrum and broad spectrum are still much, much more popular. And of course, that's very relevant to this FSA novel food enforcement discussion as well. For example, another slide where we see, okay, oil is clearly the kind of dominant product out there, followed by vapes, followed by, again, obviously, we're interested in you asking us for that data as well, followed by balms, capsule, cosmetics, and then a few other categories out there. In terms of size, we know a 10 milliliter bottle is a very, very popular product, and then a 30 milliliter bottle. And then also in terms of the oil strength, we have all the data as well, where we know, okay, a 5% or 10% oil is very, very frequent, and literally every brand has a 5 or 10% CBD oil, but maybe you should be thinking of launching a 40% CBD oil, because most likely there's actually not as much competition in that space, and potentially the margin is also much higher. The interface looks like this. So we aggregate data through our Magento 2.4 technology, and then via SQL we populate a metabase which you then get access to. We basically run a modular pricing system. So if you're interested only in formats, we can give you a price for only formats. If you're interested in pricing, if you're interested in demographics, if you're interested in gender split, obviously we have a lot of point of sale data on Alphagreen.io. So please get in touch.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for attending. It's lovely to see you all. And thank you again to Alexej and the team for letting us present. I think this is a really, really hot topic because, you know, everyone's just been talking about novel food submissions for, you know, what, a year, 2 years now. And then with everyone getting their house in order, the next question is novel food enforcement. And I don't know about you, but the last 2-3 weeks, it's been non-stop, everyone asking the question of how is this going to work? So that's what we're going to talk about today. As far as we're concerned, the dossier submission is done. We're not talking about what should be in a dossier or anything like that. This is purely going to be about enforcement. We'll touch a little bit on the changes in the FSA regime briefly, but ultimately it's all going to be about enforcement. Novel food enforcement, what are we going to be covering today? Okay, so first of all, we're going to just have some general conversations about the FSA's approachment to enforcement from a non-CBD perspective. I'm interested to hear Jonathan's thoughts on how the FSA conducts themselves when it comes to enforcing something like this. We'll also be looking in detail at trading standards, powers and punishments. What powers do trading standards actually have to intervene with non-compliant companies? I think we'll really find that useful. I'll give a quick overview of what's happening with the dossier submission deadline. It's quite confusing, and this FSA have been accused of moving the goalposts very close to the end. So that's been a hot topic of debate. The suggestion seems to be they've introduced a new stage to this. Now, some people are saying that this was actually always the case, the administration check stage, but you may have seen a lot of companies announcing that they've got pre-validation approval, and I'll sort of go into detail as to what that means. We'll be looking at what happens if you are refused validation and to see what steps you can take to address that, because obviously validation is so important. It is the difference between having a thriving business and none at all. So it's a really, really important topic to cover. And then probably most of the focus of the discussion today will be on the public registers. We've all heard that there's now going to be publicly accessible lists for not just compliant companies that have submitted dossiers, but also compliant brands and compliant products. Now, my understanding with trading standards is that effectively enforcement can be devolved to trading standards by the FSA. Can you just sort of explain what the relationship between the FSA and trading standards is? Do they work closely together, or is it more of a delegation?
So there's no delegation. The Food Standards Agency doesn't have any hierarchy over a local authority trading standards department or food authority. They're all food authorities. The FSA gives guidance sometimes, not very often, but a local authority has the power to prosecute, to use the kind of primary enforcement mechanisms in the same way that the Food Standards Agency does as well. So there's no kind of, as you might expect in the UK, there's no coherent regulatory approach. And so if you are based in an area where you have a proactive trading standards department or food regulation department, then you can be the subject of the same regulatory enforcement as you would by the Food Standards Agency. My experience is that they do work together, and that the Food Standards Agency has often in the past, because it lacked experience in bringing cases, has sent cases out to relevant trading standards departments, and they have taken them on. But I think it's also now more proactively enforcing itself.
Okay, and is there a difference between sort of national trading standards and local authority trading standards? Do they all come under the same umbrella, or are they completely separate entities?
Okay, so National Trading Standards is a funding organisation, so it's not a legal entity in itself. So National Trading Standards is a way of funding local authority trading standards. All trading standards is currently undertaken through a local authority. And so even the national parts of trading standards, such as scam busters, are all done via or all run via a particular local authority. And that's because historically all of the powers for weights and measures officers, which is where all this comes from, were local rather than national. Okay. And so National Trading Standards is effectively, I mean, it has a role, but it doesn't have an enforcement role other than to decide who gets what funding for which case. Okay,
so from what you're saying, it sounds like it can be a bit of a postcode lottery. If you're in a local borough where Trading Standards is really on it, then you could be in trouble. But if you're in a borough where they're not up to much, then maybe you're unlikely to brush up against them. Would that be fair?
Completely fair. Certain local authorities have been very poor, so they'll have a department where they only have one officer. Others, have many officers. So, very good local authorities, to give examples, would be Westminster. It's got a very active trading standards department. Northampton always used to, but has obviously been decimated by what went on. But Surrey and Buckinghamshire, which is a joint authority, is probably the one to be most feared at the moment.
Okay, interesting. So if your business is set up in Surrey and Buckinghamshire, maybe it's the time to think about a move. Trading standards obviously have a wide range of powers derived from a number of different pieces of legislation. But I think what we're interested in is what sort of powers of enforcement do trading standards have, Jonathan? Can they enter your premises and seize products? Can they shut down your e-commerce platform? I think we're quite keen to know what they can do to a non-compliant company.
Okay, so if you've got a company that is selling a product which is a novel food and has not been entered onto the public list and doesn't have any sort of agreement with the Food Standards Agency, then they are on the face of it breaking the law. What are the options that are available? So there are a range of options available to both the Food Standards Agency and the Trading Standards Department. They're primarily available under 3 pieces of legislation. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but they do just give you the gist of it. There are the 2018 England regulations. There are regulations that apply in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland as well, but let's just deal with the England regulations. Under those regulations, there can be fixed penalties, which are limited to £200, I think, at the moment, but that's the least of your worries. Next, there are compliance notices where you're given a notice saying you must comply with these steps before you before we can continue to allow you to trade. If you don't comply with it, then there is a potential criminal prosecution and a fine, an unlimited fine. Probably the most likely are stop notices, again under the 2018 regs, which mean that you are effectively injuncted to stop doing what you're doing, so you can't continue to sell. However you do that. And again, if you don't comply, then that's criminal prosecution, but only a fine if you don't comply. And then finally, under the 2018 regulations, there are unlimited fines that can be imposed for selling a novel food, which it doesn't appear or it hasn't been authorised or validated. And the final thing,
I'm sorry, go
sorry, do you want me to finish? And
yes,
the
please,
final
please.
thing that is a potential problem, this is I don't know how likely this is, but if you were the subject of trading standards investigation, a tool that they frequently use is the 2013 hygiene regulations, which provides quite a serious criminal offence for selling unsafe food. And I suspect that you may find that that they would utilise that on the basis that if it's not been validated, it's by de facto unsafe, and so that carries a maximum penalty of 5 years in prison.
Okay.
And so they're all, the reality is they have the powers in order to prevent the sale of novel foods that haven't been properly authorised or listed.
And when you talk about a stop notice, can they issue a stop notice to an e-commerce platform, or is it only sort of physical retail stores that they would do that? Because the majority of CBD is sold online. Yeah,
so they issue a stop notice to a person, and that includes a company. So they wouldn't do it to a website or a store. They would simply do it to the director or the company involved and say you must stop selling CBD, and if you don't, then we will enforce. And so,
okay. Could that result in them coming and seizing stock and that kind of thing? Do they have that sort of power?
Yeah, they do have power to seize stock under the Food Safety Act. I'd want to look fairly carefully at the circumstances before you answered that, because there is I think you would possibly need to show that the food was unsafe. So there are arguments, although I think there is potentially a power to do that. I'm not convinced that they could achieve it without at least some good argument against it.
Okay, thank you. So deadline day disruption. So the previous position was that to lawfully sell, for CBD companies to lawfully sell from 1st of April 2021, products had to be included in a validated submission. So not only did you have to have your dossier in by 31st of March, you also had to have it validated. And that meant that you could carry on and selling whilst you're waiting for your submission to be considered for full authorization. That changed. 11th of March, the FSA announced that they were this previous position that everyone was working to was not going to be workable, and that was frustrating for a lot of companies because we'd all been expecting validation to come in before 1st of April. So companies worked very, very hard to get their dossiers in as early as possible. And to date, I'm not sure anyone has received validation other than Purist CBD, I think, has a synthetic product and I'm told that they received early validation because, in fact, they submitted to the EFSA prior to January, and that was just transferred straight across to the FSA, and that's why they got such an early submission. But as I said, that's a synthetic CBD product. The new regime is that there was to be an 8-day admin check, and in fact, all you needed to do to be able to benefit from the exemption to allow you to continue to supply was to have a dossier in that had passed this administration check, this admin check. And in fact, I've seen a number of companies on LinkedIn and various other places announcing that they had this pre-validation approval. And I think there was a lot of sort of confusion as to why this change had been made at the last minute. Jonathan, from your experience, looking at the way this regime has been implemented, it seems that there's no regulations it's based on, there's been no consultation. It seems quite arbitrary in a lot of ways. Is that common, or it doesn't seem like a good basis for a regulatory regime to me?
Okay, so it seems to me one of the more muddled things that has come out of Brexit, the way in which we have adopted the EU laws that underpin this novel foods regime has been effectively to say we adopt the Commission implementing regulation 2017. And so all that we can see in the Novel Foods Amendment EU exit regs, so the way in which we change this from EU law to UK law, is that they've broadly adopted what was in there. The problem with that is that it doesn't include any of the detail you might expect or need for applications like this, which are complex. If you compare it to pharmaceutical, medical device authorizations, you'll see that there is complex and detailed regulation. And I think you can see that the most in the fact that there is little by way of guidance on how you make the applications, little by way of guidance on what is required, and nothing about timescales, the different lists that they seem to be responding to, and most importantly, and I think this is probably the most important, there doesn't appear to be an appeal mechanism, and so it's a muddle. They'll know it's a muddle, and that's an advantage, but it really is a muddle.
When you say it's an advantage, do you mean an advantage to CBD companies that perhaps want to take on the FSA and fight over particular issues?
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that because there is no appeal mechanism, what do you do if you don't have an authorization on the list? In that situation, you're breaking the criminal law by continuing to sell any of your products. What do you do in that situation? Well, you've only really got one avenue to go down. Firstly, you can you can reason with the FSA, but say they don't buy that, and the only thing you could do is judicially review. And I think that's probably the avenue where most joy will be had in these situations, because the procedure is such a muddle, and you will be able to run the argument that this is procedurally irregular. Okay. And I think that's basically what I would say. I think so. The reason it's an advantage is that when there is a muddle out by a public authority about procedure, there are good arguments against the orders being valid.
Okay, well, we'll touch on judicial review later on in the presentation, but I think it's important that the takeaway from that is not to be afraid of the FSA and to be prepared to take them on if they don't give you what you want. But we'll come on to that in more detail. So this pre-validation approval now, this administration check, here's the European Industrial Hemp Association, a press release on 23rd of March. And this is a pretty big deal, I think. Full spectrum CBD has been debated as to whether or not it can achieve novel food compliance at all because of the controlled cannabinoid content. The general view was that a full spectrum product, was at serious risk of not receiving validation or authorization from the FSA. the European Industrial Hemp Association believe the fact that their submission for full spectrum has passed its administrative check. They think that's a really positive thing, and hopefully they can also achieve validation for that. But what this means is that full spectrum products can continue to be sold post 1st of April for the moment. The flip side to that is just on Friday, the ACMD announced that they were starting a consultation for THC content in CBD products. So this follows on from the Malthouse letter, which we saw a couple of months ago, where Kit Malthouse wrote to the ACMD asking for some information as to what should be considered the minimum contents of THC and controlled cannabinoids in CBD products. And the ACMD has responded by asking for submissions, and they've listed 7 questions. And basically it's an open process where anyone can make a submission with evidence, with representations in relation to these questions. And they will obviously make a decision on what should be an appropriate amount of THC in a CBD product. My concern here is, although the AHA announcement was very positive for full spectrum, this question list is now talking about CBN and THCV and other controlled cannabinoids. Even THCA is listed in there. And if they start focusing on other controlled cannabinoids, that might be the end for full spectrum altogether. But again, we'll have to wait and see. Do make sure you get your submissions in, because I think it's a really important topic that is linked to novel foods. Jonathan, do you have any idea how much notice an organisation like the ACMD would take of submissions in a consultation process? Is everything considered, or is it more of a just for show?
No, I assume that they approach it on the basis of on a good faith basis. It will depend on the quality of the submission, I suspect, and the person making it.
I imagine it needs to be backed up with some evidence as well. So do get your submissions in if you are able to. Right, here we come to the meat of this presentation, the public register. Okay, so I don't know if you remember from my last presentation, I had made up some companies. So what information are companies expected to submit in order to be on the register? What information is the register going to show? Well, the FSA sent out a spreadsheet, and this is just my made up submission. I've missed off a couple of columns as well, but generally London Hemp is an ingredients manufacturer, and they also do white labeling as well. So we'll come on to white labeling in a bit, but imagine London Hemp is a licensed producer and manufacturer, but they also do white labeling. And here you can see they produce a 5% CBD product, a 10% CBD product, a 15% CBD product. Every single product is apparently going to be listed on the public register. So it's not the case you can get a 5% product on there and then go and sell 10% and 15%. My understanding is every product has to be listed on there. You've got their application reference, so they will have submitted their dossier and received an application reference. And then the last column shows they are a primary submission. So they have made their own novel food submission, their own dossier, okay? You've then got a brand. This is my made up brand, Jappie CBD, and they would also be asked to submit evidence in relation to their products. And so even if I'm buying from London Hemp, I still have to confirm that my products are linked to their submission. So I'm not expected to do a full submission, but I would be incorporated under London Hemp submission, and these would be my products that would appear on the list, covered under London Hemp's umbrella submission. So that's what we understand how this public register is going to work. It won't just be for companies that have have submitted a dossier and have had it validated. It will also include all of the products that they are making for other companies, and therefore that's how enforcement will take place. This register becomes absolutely vital. Effectively, if you can get your product on the register, you're good to go. If you can't, then you've got a bit of a problem. Jonathan, in your view, I mean, I was a bit concerned. This is a lot of commercially sensitive information that's going to be publicly available, and I know some companies are not very happy having to disclose all of the identities of the companies that they are supplying to. On the flip side, I know some companies who are happy about being able to see this information. I suppose it's an opportunity to reach out and try and steal clients. But I think there is some comfort provided to suppliers, because it seems to be that once a product is on there, they're going to be stuck with their supplier unless there's exceptional circumstances. Is it normal to have to submit sort of commercially sensitive information like this and make it publicly available, Jonathan? Have you seen this before?
So it's two things. First of all, submitting it in any application to validate a product, there will often be commercially sensitive material that is submitted. The problem isn't that. The problem is what is going to be published on the register, and I think that is the difficult issue. There appears to be a mechanism through which you can ask the FSA not to put onto the register material which is commercially sensitive, but you have to provide a verifiable reason. I think the reason they want to have the names of suppliers, etc., on the register is so that people can look at the register and say, well, this has been effectively authorized. And so I think that will be the difficulty in persuading them not to publish that material, but there is a mechanism for doing so.
Okay. I'm just going to comment on the white labelling issue. So there was a big concern that this novel food regime would mean that white labelling companies were effectively squeezed out, because they're not expected to make the primary submission. They don't have perhaps control of the manufacturing procedure for the active ingredients. So where the white labelling companies fit into this, I'm not really sure. What I will say is you're starting to see the licensed producers of like London Hemp merging with the white labelling companies. So you may have seen Jen Canna acquired Taylor Mammon. So Taylor Mammon, one of the very well-known white labelling companies, and congratulations to Nathan and the guys at Taylor Mammon. You also now have Mile High, who are not just manufacturing the active ingredients, they are also giving their own white labelling offering as well. Sativa Group PLC as well, they are doing the same. So I'm just, it does seem to be that this middle position of being a white labelling company may be in jeopardy, but it seems like companies have perhaps known this for a while and are taking steps to deal with that accordingly. So to get on the public register, not only do you have to have your products included in a dossier that's been submitted to the FSA, there's also the new products restriction, which I really don't like this restriction, but I'll go through it and then perhaps we can chat, we can discuss how it's supposed to work. So the FSA wrote to all of the companies who had submitted a novel foods dossier, and they said, thank you very much, and they set out how these public registers were going to work. And it was in this letter that they stated only CBD products that were on sale at the time of the FSA's deadline announcement, so that's 13th of February 2020, and linked to a suitably validated novel food application should remain on sale from the 1st of April 2021. So there's actually two conditions to be able to benefit from the exemption, which allows you to continue to sell post 1st of April. The dossier, and also being able to prove that you were on the market prior to 13th of February. The FSA will decide whether there is sufficient proof of existing sales to be allowed on the public list. And what they say in this letter, acceptable documents for the required proof of sale include receipts, invoices, contracts, so that'll be sales contracts, VAT receipts, itemized bills, maybe they mean, I don't know, bank accounts, bank statements or something like that, and letters and correspondence with suppliers and manufacturers. Now, the reason why the FSA put this restriction in is they said they wanted to encourage existing brands to focus on achieving CBD compliance for existing products. They didn't really want new entrants into the market. They didn't want loads of new products being brought onto the market while everyone was focusing on novel food. And they admitted that this would effectively kill innovation in the sector for a couple of years. There'll be no new products being formulated. There'd be very little R&D going on into new products because you wouldn't be able to put them on the market effectively until you received full authorization, and that could be 18 months down the line or however long. The reason I don't like this is because a lot of companies have spent big money on achieving novel food compliance. You're talking hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pounds in some cases. Surely having spent that money, achieved novel food compliance, they should then be able to commercialize that position. And that means taking on new customers, taking on new clients, being able to produce new products. But that doesn't seem to be the case here, Jonathan. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on whether this is really justified. Was it really necessary to bring in a restriction like this?
I think it's because of government pressure. The reality is that CBD and novel foods has been on the agenda for years now. People have known about the risks about this for some time, and basically what has happened is an industry has grown up. At the same time, the Food Standards Agency didn't intervene, didn't really know what to do, and has come to the party a little too late. And it's also a function of the fact that for a while it wasn't clear where it was going to be categorized, whether it was a medicine, whether it's a food, whether it's some of them it just needs to be treated as a cosmetic or a safe product. And so I think what the Food Standards Agency are faced with now is the position that they consider these to be novel foods. They have to deal with them as novel foods, and consequently they have to draw a line in the sand and say no more until they're authorised. And I think that's the approach they're taking. Whether it's fair or not, I don't know. It's a political decision rather than it seems to me to be a decision based upon any kind of commercial savvy. Okay, all right, thank you.
Maybe just on this point, because I think this is actually kind of the elephant in the room here, but ultimately, would you expect big brands, and I can name a few of the MSOs recently creating a brand in the UK, and clearly there is no way they can actually show that they were having any product before February 2020, right? I think that's, again, this is maybe not the right slide, but obviously there is this other announcement that, or kind of the proof that you have to show that you were buying product with all the invoices before February 2020. That's obviously a clear challenge, right? Where you can actually say, look, that doesn't make any sense, and yes, it's political, etc. Can you challenge the FSA? What do you think is the likelihood that a brand then will succeed?
So it depends on what it is. If you're saying I want to put a new product on the market now that hasn't been validated, etc., I think your prospects of success are low. If you are saying that my product was already on the market before that time, well, then there are plenty. That's just an evidential question as to whether it was or not, and whether it can be shown that it was in a kind of reasonable way. There is potentially a challenge to the failure to consult on that issue, but I think it's one that is potentially difficult.
Yeah, because my view is that if I was to come to the market now and I went to a novel food compliant manufacturer and white labeler, and I said make me a 5%, 10%, 15% CBD, and they've been through the process, and they make me these products that are novel food compliant, and I put my label on it. According to the FSA, that's a new product, and I can't put that on the market. But from a safety perspective, I don't think that restriction is justified, is it?
Yeah, I think that is arguable, because you're not saying we're putting a new product on. We're saying we're putting the same product on. We're just calling it something different.
Yeah,
I think that's different. So I think there are two arguments, aren't there? If you bring to now a completely new product, then you are likely to be the subject of enforcement. Yeah. But if you can argue that it's effectively the same product then that was available before that time, the whole issue is safety, and so in that situation you would have a safe product unless it's been used, and that would be the argument you would run.
Well, then maybe that's a big challenge for the white labeling companies to take up then, and say, look, we should be able to take on new customers provided they are using our approved product line. But yeah, the FSA position at the moment is that they won't allow that. So that's maybe something open to a challenge at some point.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, I think again, yeah, the text that's 13th February 2020 rather than 2021. Exactly. And then you
apologies. Yeah, that's my mistake.
Yeah. So basically, then you as a white label company, you should then be able to show actually that the product hasn't maybe changed in the last 18 months. And then you can actually make the argument that, well, if you've been buying the product in the last 3 months or before February 2020, it should actually be the same product, and therefore you should be allowed to sell it.
Yeah, agreed. Okay, well, we'll come on to how we can challenge the FSA at a later date. So, the list itself. So, this information was posted recently on LinkedIn by Greer Deal at GRS. So, thank you very much, Greer, for letting me share it. So, for those who don't know, Greer is one of the top regulatory consultants in this area. She's managing CBD novel food submissions for a lot of big companies. And she's been on the phone to Paul Tossell at the Novel Foods Department at the FSA. And this is the information that has been provided. There will first of all be a senior list, which all of the validated dossiers will be listed on. So applications which contain all of the necessary content for a novel food application and have been validated by the FSA will go on that list. So if you've submitted a complete dossier with all of your tox data and your stability testing and everything, then you go straight onto the senior list. And there'll be a junior list which pending validation dossiers will be listed on. So these are applications which are incomplete but demonstrate a commitment to submitting the information. So that will be you will have to provide evidence that you are engaged in laboratory testing in relation to a toxicology study. And I think a lot of the consortiums have used this approach, in particular the EIHA. They are going to be doing substantial studies in relation to toxicology and all sorts of other things, and they will submit that at a later date. So these two dossiers, and I assume the way that it works is that if you haven't submitted a complete dossier, you'll go on the junior list, and then once you've submitted all your information, your studies, you'll then receive validation and go onto the senior list. Now, I'm told both lists will allow you to continue to sell post 1st of April. So as long as you're on one of those lists, as long as your products are on one of those lists, then you should be able to go forward. Jonathan, I'm told that the reason this has been introduced is because the novel food regulations themselves say that you cannot validate a submission without all of the key data in there. So I'm assuming the FSA are trying to sort of fudge this in a way that will allow companies who are engaged in these long and difficult and expensive studies to carry on selling whilst they achieve that data. Is that something you've seen before, or does that sound right to you?
So the information that is required is set out in the European law, and it's quite reasonably detailed. What's interesting about it is that there's nothing underpinning having 2 lists or 3 lists or 4 lists at all. There's only reference to a single list. What the FSA have done here is basically drawn an arbitrary distinction on the basis that they think those that have produced everything that they need to, so fall within category 1, are okay, and those that have identified what they need to produce for category 2 also are okay. I think that the lack of procedure, the lack of transparency and clarity here is going to make it very difficult to defend. And I suspect there'll be value judgments about whether a business has correctly identified that which it needs to provide and provided a reasonable basis for submitting that data. I think without concrete rules and guidance, etc., this is a very vulnerable aspect of the way in which the FSA is operating at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's a good summation of it. So how is this public register supposed to work? So when you've got the big retailers, Tesco, Lloyds, Boots, Holland and Barrett, these companies, these high street chains which stock CBD products, ultimately, I expect the FSA will absent themselves from enforcement, and they will be expecting retailers to consult the public register before deciding whether to stock a brand or not. Do you think big name retailers like this are familiar with this kind of thing, Jonathan? Can we expect them to stick to this rigorously? I know Holland and Barrett has always liked to sort of bend the rules a little bit, but I can imagine they're going to have no excuse to not have consulted the register.
Well, I'm not going to comment on any of the 4 retailers that you've identified, because as a matter of record, I've represented all 4 of them. But but I would say generally, if you've got a big business that has a product that is unlawful to sell, they will stop selling it immediately. And I don't see any prospect at all of any business selling a product which that isn't on the list, because they will know that they'll be committing a criminal offence by doing so. And so
Okay.
I just don't see. You may get other people who are willing to break the criminal law, but I doubt that very many even smaller retailers will be willing to do that.
Okay, so we can probably expect to see retailers follow the rules rigorously in relation to the public register. So that brings us to.
Yeah. Sorry,
go ahead.
Yeah, so the moment a product is being sold unlawfully, they will just take it off the shelves completely,
right,
and won't sell it again. Just because to do so, they run the risk of committing criminal offences, which no business really wants to do.
No, of course. Okay, so now we come to how you can challenge the FSA, and I'll take these 2 together. What can a company do if the application is refused validation, and what can a company do if the FSA refused to accept evidence of a product being on the market?
Okay, so there is no mechanism, there is no express mechanism for challenging a decision of the FSA under these rules and regulations. And so currently there is no appeal process. Quite often there are internal appeal process, but there is nothing. There is nothing out there. There's nothing that they have published that I have seen, at least. The only mechanism for challenge will be judicial review, which would be on the basis that it is a public authority, and a judicial review could be brought by the business that is the subject of somebody not getting a validated entry onto the list, or the FSA refusing to accept that it was available on the market before. Judicial review is a difficult remedy, but there are there are a number of steps that you can take to make the argument for it. I think here the arguments are likely to be around procedure, not adopting the right procedure, failing to put in place clear guidelines as to how it should be operate, and inconsistency between the treatment of applications. And I think that's probably the grounds for bringing judicial review proceedings. I think there is also a big problem that this seems to have been very much ad hoc. It doesn't seem to be clear rules about how the system is being operated, and I think all of that is potentially useful for judicial review proceedings. The problem with judicial review proceedings is that they would take time, and so the effect of and not getting on the list is that you couldn't then sell your product lawfully, and so the only remedy then would be to go under the rules and make an urgent challenge. You can do so under a particular judicial review procedure, but judicial review is one of those remedies which requires a deal of work to be done before you make the submission. It's not like an ordinary civil claim. It has to be done very quickly, but you have to have everything ready to go at the point at which you make the application. That's a requirement of the procedure. So if you fear you might not get a listing on the 6th of April, you'd be well advised to think about putting together the bare bones of what an application might look like, an interim application in particular, saying why it needs to be urgent and the mistakes that have been made and why it's unfair, why there is inconsistency, that kind of thing. You need to be thinking about that now, because from the moment they close the door, you'll find that all retailers stop selling your products and you can't sell your product. And if you do start selling your product in the interim, then you run the risk of heavy fines. The fines in this area are likely to be massive, hundreds of thousands potentially, and criminal penalties that are potentially very serious as well. And so you need to be thinking, what is my next step? And to do that, you need to understand that judicial review, being the only remedy that you have, takes time. And so you need to prepare yourself. So it may be, hopefully you won't need to do it, but the preparations for judicial review applications can be achieved, in a relatively short period of time, but it will require drafting of witness statements, that kind of thing, ahead of any application.
So look, the word on the street is that the public registers aren't going to go up until the 6th of April, until after Easter, and the rationale behind that is, here in the UK we have the Easter weekend, so Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, there'll be no one at the FSA working, and so they don't want to put the lists up on the 1st of April, and then there's 4 days where everyone's going ballistic and there's no one in the office to deal with it. The question I have is, let's say the registers go up on the 6th of April and my product's not on there. You're saying that we'd have to do an emergency judicial review. Am I able to continue to sell my products whilst the judicial review is being considered? Can the court grant sort of interim relief to allow me to continue to sell whilst they're looking at the matter?
Yes. So the procedure for doing that is to go effectively as an injunction, and so you can do that in judicial review proceedings. You need to set out why it's urgent, why you need to continue selling it, and then a court would consider what the merits of the application are, whether you've got a good point or not, and whether it's better in the interim for you to stop selling or and decide a thing quickly, or whether or not the FSA have got a good point and you shouldn't be able to continue selling until it's been finally determined.
Okay.
But I think in this situation, you have to be bear in mind one important feature. The FSA are not going to want to be litigating much of this. And so you may find that the threat of judicial review and bringing judicial review is sufficient to persuade them to permit you to continue selling on the interim. You may also find that they take a very robust approach, but I doubt it. So take a strong position, be up for a fight, and the likelihood is they won't want to dig themselves into lots of litigation with lots of companies. That's your expectation, I suppose. Well, I mean, reality is you haven't got a choice, have you? You've got either you get them to change their mind, or you change the decision, or you can't sell your product. So that's it. I mean, there are other ways of arguing it in the criminal courts, which is it's not novel food, it's not food. There are other arguments like that, but that debate seems to have moved on. I know the discussion about that was a couple of years ago was quite important, but I don't know if those points are being taken in the same way.
Alexej, we've got one more slide. Are we okay to carry on? Are we good for time?
No, we're good for time. Absolutely. Just maybe on the previous slide, a question then. If people were to challenge, or if people were to submit a document to challenge the FSA, what are the costs CBD brands are looking to incur if they would to do so? And I mean, I'm sure Robert Jappie wants to almost do a consortium of brands who want to challenge the FSA. Could you say anything about the costs involved?
Yeah, if you want to instruct Jonathan, you might need to remortgage your house. So a consortium application is probably the best way forward. So if there is a group of like-minded companies that wanted to take that on, I'm assuming that sort of approach, a group action, a class action, is fine, Jonathan?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I suspect what will happen is those that don't get on the list will judicially review, and those that do will not. But I think people have to be realistic. The moment the door shuts, they cannot trade, so they need to be getting their preparation in, soon. They need to be thinking about what they've got to do, because it won't happen overnight.
Yeah, sure. Okay, all right, brilliant. Thank you. Right, we're close to the end, guys, and then hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A. So you may have seen a few organisations announcing these primary authority partnerships with trading standards. So Love Hemp had one a while ago with Buckinghamshire and Surrey, which is one of the ones you said was a good one, I think, Jonathan. Yep. ACI announced theirs with, I think it was with National Trading Standards, but I'm not sure about that. And then TTS Pharma are one of the really good suppliers in the sector, and they've announced one too. How are these partnerships supposed to work? I mean, they've been sort of trumpeted as a really big deal by a lot of these companies, and I suppose it shows them to be particularly compliant. But what are the benefits of actually having one of these relationships, Jonathan?
So primary authority partnerships came about because of the Regulatory Enforcement and Sanctions Act of 2008. It was designed to cut red tape. It was designed for businesses that were finding that they were enforced in a different way in different local authority areas, to have consistency. So the idea is that you have a relationship with your primary authority. It doesn't have to be the authority where you're based, but say an authority that you are comfortable with, and they would give you advice and guidance on how you can comply with the law. And then the way in which that bites is that if you comply with their advice and guidance, you can't be the subject of regulatory action by somebody else. Okay, so that's the heart of it. And so it's on the face of it, primary authority partnerships work. They're very, very effective. They're very useful. I would encourage any business to engage in one. They're very, very cheap by comparison to other regulatory advice that you might receive, and they serve a great function. The problem here is that there's not much scope for advice and guidance. The only question that there are two questions. One, is it a novel food? And two, are you on the register? And so they could give you an advice and guidance that that a CBD product was not a novel food, and then that would be great because you couldn't be prosecuted, but it's likely to be challenged. And so if that advice and guidance was wrong, which it seems likely, that's likely to be the position now, it wouldn't stand up. So it's not particularly valuable. And as to whether or not you were on the list, well, what advice and guidance can you give on that? You are on the list, you're not on the list. And so I think it's likely primary authority partnerships are a valuable thing, but in this situation, they're not valuable at all, just because the two questions are that you could receive advice and guidance are just limited and of no value to you. So
just so I understand, if your partner, your primary authority partner says, yes, what you're doing is fine, then that protects you from anyone else intervening and saying, no, you're not, provided they got their advice right. If they got their advice to you wrong, then that doesn't really help you at all.
Yeah, so a good example would be advice. So the one big case, which was against Greggs, brought by a local authority, and it was to do with Greggs having seats in their shops, and it was said that it was called the Great Toilet Case, but it was a case where their primary authority has said you don't need a toilet if you have fewer than 10 seats, and that was across the country, and that was challenged by another local authority who said, we want you to have toilets. It was in Hull, actually. We want you to install toilets in our Greggs because you've got 10 seats there. Greg refused, and there was a battle, on the primary authority battle, that ended up in the High Court. I was representing Greggs at the time, and what the court there said was that if the advice is wrong in law, then it doesn't have to be followed, so you could be pursued. Greggs won in the end because we managed to find a different way of doing it, but the rule is, so if a local authority now gives you advice to say it's not novel food, and it is, then it's not going to help you.
Okay, so just for our non-British friends, Greg sells sandwiches and pasties, and I can't imagine anyone ever wanting to go to a toilet in there. But there we are. The concern I think this is a concern that a number of people have raised with me, is that this sort of partnership creates a relationship where snitching and informing on non-compliant companies can take place. So the idea being is, right, I'm engaged with Buckinghamshire and Surrey trading standards, and if I see that you're operating in a non-compliant fashion, I'll get them onto you. Is that a possibility, or is that something that can happen?
It could happen. I don't know. Is the answer?
Not seen that happen
Depend upon the authority. I suspect there are. The reality is that if you are selling a product after the 6th of April, which is not on the list, people are going to inform on you.
Yeah, well, you would. If I was a company that has spent hundreds of thousands of pounds on novel food compliance, and I see one of my competitors hasn't spent a penny and nothing happens to them, I'd be furious. So I think we will see widespread enforcement. But I think it's that public register will be the deciding factor. You're either on it or you're not. So I think it becomes incredibly important to get yourself on there.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then on the e-commerce platform, there is a question how the enforcement will work. I guess, as Jonathan said, the FSA will just write a letter to the business, to the director of the business. But what about if the business is actually headquartered, let's say, in Germany, and is selling into the UK? What about enforcement then?
The regulations apply to those selling food into the UK to UK consumers. So there is a process. It's become much more complicated because of Brexit, but there is a process through which the issues can be, the informations or the enforcement action can be taken. But I think it's made more difficult. And there are good questions about how you would achieve it. It's likely to discourage enforcement, I would say, where you have a business that is overseas at the moment, just because bedding in the new mechanisms for enforcement overseas is likely to take a bit of time.
What regulatory agency will have the responsibility of combating counterfeits of legitimate novel foods approved products?
I think that would be squarely in trading standards remit, Jonathan. Would that be right?
Yeah. So Trading Standards has the responsibility for dealing with that. They don't do very much of it, and so there is capacity in that situation for what a lot of the brands, just general brands, clothing brands, have done, where there hasn't been the appetite for local authorities to spend money enforcing that kind of thing, because they kind of take the view that these are big businesses who can take care of themselves. There are different both civil and criminal mechanisms that a business can go down, private prosecution, which has become commonplace in that kind of IP theft, counterfeiting arena, but also civil cases that you can bring as well, and they've become commonplace in relation to other areas, and I suspect there's no reason why it wouldn't apply in relation to novel food, CBD, that kind of thing.
No, I had a case once where some guy was selling like keychains and gear stick knobs for Porsches and Lamborghinis and this and that, and he was just buying counterfeit stuff from China and reselling it, and Trading Standards actually took on that prosecution. But I think they were under pressure from the likes of Porsche and Mercedes and BMW to take action. So yeah, the Trading Standards can do it, but some companies might choose to take up the mantle themselves.
Mm-hmm. And then another one on about the 13th of February 2020 date. So imagine you as a brand, you were buying your supply from a white label producer who's now on the list. But then, let's say in March 2020, you changed your supplier to a supplier who no longer is on the list. What can you do?
So in fact, the brands are really tightly linked to their suppliers. They're not supposed to change suppliers unless the FSA has said there's exceptional circumstances. So, again, exceptional circumstances doesn't really have a complete definition. If your current supplier goes out of business or decides to stop selling CBD, then that would be considered an exceptional circumstances, and you would be able to switch your supplier. But yeah, deciding to switch suppliers just for no reason, you may find yourself in difficulties. Again, I don't see how that could be enforceable, because as long as you're switching from one novel food compliance supplier to another one, I can't see what argument on the grounds of safety. I mean, one isolate is going to be pretty much the same as another. It may be more difficult if you're switching distillate suppliers, but again, I don't think the FSA will actually complain about that kind of thing. They'll go after the low-hanging fruit rather than focusing on every little tiny infraction, I imagine.
Yeah, we actually know of several brands on Alphagreen.io who did switch suppliers for cost reasons, or going from full spectrum to isolate, or isolate to broad spectrum. So I would actually say it's quite common. And it's just an interesting one where you probably will show the invoices from before February 2020, yet you are already buying from another supplier, right? And it's this kind of lack of clarity from the FSA almost encourages cheating.
Yeah, FSA could pick up on that and say, "Well, hold on, you're giving us documents for a different supplier to the one you're saying you're included in their submission now." So, yeah, again, open to see how that gets dealt with in due course, and if anyone has that problem and wants to challenge, then they can get in touch.
It's also not clear how the FSA is going to be monitoring this in an ongoing way. There's very little there which indicates what it should and shouldn't be doing. I suspect that there'll be very little monitoring, certainly in the short term.
And then I guess,
Alexej, and thank you, Jonathan. Thanks, everyone. All the best.
Bye.